I've got two wedding stories that'll stick with me for the rest of my life. And when I say stick, I mean these are burned into my memory like a brand. They're the kind of stories you can't help but tell at parties, because people just don't believe stuff like this actually happens. But I was there, front and center, and I can tell you it absolutely did. The first story is about my buddy. Let's call him Josh. We'd been friends since high school, played football together, got into trouble together, and generally just lived life side by side for years. Now, for months before his wedding, Josh had been telling us all about his fiancée, Melanie. The funny thing was, none of us had ever met her. He'd moved out of state a while back, so we didn't see him as much, and he kept saying Melanie was shy. Shy, huh? That's why she never came to any of our group gatherings. Honestly, we didn't think too much about it at first. I mean, some people are just like that. But as the months passed, I started getting curious. Shy or not, after all this time, you'd think we'd at least meet her once, right? It was almost like Josh was keeping her in some kind of bubble or maybe hiding her away. So, fast forward to the wedding day. We were all stoked to finally meet this elusive fiancé of his. The ceremony was set in this picturesque little chapel out in the country. It had one of those classic rustic feels, white wooden pews, stained glass windows that caught the light just right, and an open field where they planned to have the reception. The kind of place you'd expect to see in a magazine or a Hallmark movie. The vibe was perfect. We were all dressed to the nines, and there was this buzz in the air that only comes from seeing a good friend tie the knot. Everyone was ready for what we assumed would be a beautiful, if not emotional, ceremony. But as we're all sitting there, waiting for things to kick off, we start noticing something odd. The ceremony was supposed to start at 2 p.m. sharp. By 2:15, nothing. By 2:30, people are shifting in their seats, whispering to each other, checking the program like maybe they got the time wrong. Still nothing. That's when I looked over at Josh's face. The dude was sweating bullets. He wasn't pacing or anything, but you could tell he was holding it together by a thread. His groomsmen were trying to keep him calm, cracking jokes to take the edge off, but it wasn't working. The guy looked like he was about to bolt. Finally, around 2:45, the doors at the back of the chapel creaked open. And when I say creaked, I mean it was this loud, drawn-out groan that only added to the tension. Everyone turns their heads, expecting to see the bride all composed and glowing, maybe fashionably late, but still radiant. Instead, what we got was a stumbling, swaying figure, barely recognizable in her wedding dress. It was Melanie, but she was a complete mess. Her veil was crooked, her makeup smeared, and she was gripping onto one of her bridesmaids like her life depended on it. You could hear a pin drop in that chapel. Turns out Melanie had been pre-gaming the wedding with champagne. A lot of champagne. From what I heard later, she'd been hitting the bubbly all morning, telling everyone she was just trying to calm her nerves. But by the time 2 p.m. rolled around, she wasn't just relaxed, she was absolutely plastered. She stumbled down the aisle like a newborn deer, barely able to walk in her heels, and her bridesmaids were practically holding her up, their faces frozen in these awkward, pained smiles as if everything was completely normal. It was one of those moments where you just didn't know whether to laugh or feel bad. Josh, though, man, the look on his face was priceless. He went from concerned to horrified in about 2 seconds flat. But bless him, he tried to hold it together. You could see him whispering to himself, probably repeating, "Everything's going to be fine," over and over like a mantra. As she got closer to the altar, Melanie tripped on the hem of her dress and nearly face-planted. One of her bridesmaids caught her just in time, but the whole congregation gasped. It was like watching a car wreck in slow motion. You didn't want to see what was going to happen next, but you couldn't look away either. Somehow, and I still don't know how, she made it to the front without completely collapsing. She swayed next to Josh, blinking like she was trying to focus on where she was. I could see Josh shooting glances at the officiant like, what the hell are we supposed to do now? But the officiant, bless his heart, just kept that same calm, steady tone, trying to push forward with the ceremony, as if this was all totally normal. I gotta give him credit for that. He was determined to get through it no matter what. When it came time for the vows, though, that's when things really went off the rails. Melanie was supposed to repeat after the officiant, right? Standard stuff. But when he started saying, "I, Melanie, take thee, Josh," she just giggled. And not a sweet, nervous giggle either. No, this was a full-on drunken cackle. She couldn't get through a single sentence without breaking into laughter, slurring her words, or just flat out forgetting what she was supposed to say. At one point, she called Josh by the wrong name. I think she said John or something, which, if you ask me, is not exactly the most confidence-boosting moment for a groom. Josh, at this point, looked like he was about to keel over. He didn't even try to hide the panic anymore. He was sweating through his tux and his eyes were darting around the room, probably wondering if he should just call the whole thing off. I mean, can you blame him? But here's the kicker. The ceremony didn't stop. They somehow got through it, though I couldn't tell you how. Melanie slurred her way through the vows, laughing and hiccuping the whole time, while Josh stood there like a deer caught in the headlights. By the end, when they finally said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," there was this awkward applause. Everyone clapped, but it was that kind of polite, hesitant clapping you hear when nobody knows how to react. And instead of the bride and groom walking down the aisle together, arm in arm, Melanie just wobbled her way back the way she came, with Josh trailing behind like he was her handler. We all kind of sat there in stunned silence after that. What do you even say in a moment like that? We had just witnessed a train wreck and we hadn't even gotten to the reception yet. So there we are in the middle of the vows. Josh is standing there, sweating through his tux, waiting for Melanie to get through one simple line. "I promise to love you," but it's clear she's beyond that point of no return. Her eyes were glassy, and she couldn't even stand still, shifting her weight from one foot to the other like she was on a rocking boat. The officiant, bless his patience, tries to guide her through it, repeating the words slowly, as if she was a kid learning to read for the first time. "I promise to love you," he says, each word drawn out, giving her a lifeline to hold on to. "But Melanie?" She's giggling like a schoolgirl at a slumber party, unable to take anything seriously. She slurred through a few words, something like, "I promise, love you," then stopped mid-sentence, staring blankly at Josh, as if she had no idea what came next. Then she did something none of us saw coming. She waved it off like it didn't even matter, just flapped her hand in the air and said, "Hey, whatever," in this dismissive, drunken tone. The whole crowd went silent. You could practically hear the collective intake of breath from the guests. It's not often you see a bride just give up on her vows mid-ceremony, but here we were, witnessing it. Josh looked like he'd just been sucker punched. And then, just to make the situation more surreal, Melanie slapped him on the arm. Hard. Not a playful tap, but a full-on angry slap, like she was mad at him for standing there. The sound echoed through the chapel. I could see the color drain from Josh's face. The poor guy didn't even flinch, though. He just stood there in complete shock, staring at her like he couldn't believe what was happening. The guests gasped, some people murmured, and a few of the bridesmaids exchanged nervous glances, probably wondering if they should step in. But before anyone could react, Melanie, of course, managed to knock over the glass of champagne she'd been holding onto, spilling it all down the front of her pristine white dress. It was like watching a slow-motion disaster unfold. The champagne soaked into the fabric, creating this huge, dark stain right in the middle of her dress. That's when she lost it. Full meltdown. 1 second she was laughing, and the next she's sobbing uncontrollably. Not the quiet, delicate kind of crying you might expect from a bride overwhelmed by emotions. No, this was a full-on ugly cry, loud, wailing sobs that echoed through the room. She just stood there, blubbering, while Josh looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. At this point, everyone's awkwardly shuffling in their seats, unsure if they should be comforting her or pretending they hadn't just witnessed a total wedding implosion. I mean, what do you do in that situation? No one had any answers. The bridesmaids tried to approach her, but Melanie wasn't having it. She yanked away from them, stumbled toward one of the reception tables at the side of the room, and, wait for it, crawled under the table. Yep, she just got down on all fours and crawled right under there, sobbing like a toddler who didn't get their way. Josh followed her, looking absolutely miserable, crouching down beside the table, trying to coax her out. You could hear him quietly whisper, "Melanie, come on. Please, just get up." But she wasn't budging. She stayed under there, crying her eyes out, while half the wedding guests were craning their necks trying to get a glimpse, and the other half were pretending this wasn't the most uncomfortable thing they'd ever witnessed. At that point, it was clear the whole thing was beyond saving. The officiant mumbled something about proceeding with the ceremony, but Josh shook his head, probably realizing that whatever this day was supposed to be, it was long gone. Eventually someone, maybe the wedding planner, I'm not sure, gently suggested that maybe we all head over to the reception area while things got sorted out. And that was that. The ceremony never technically finished, but by that point I don't think anyone cared. We all shuffled out to the reception tent, dazed and confused, while Melanie stayed huddled under the table, sobbing like the world was ending. It was hands down the most surreal, uncomfortable experience I've ever had at a wedding. I couldn't decide if I felt bad for Josh, or if I just wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all. As you can probably guess, that marriage didn't last long. 4 months later, they were divorced. Big shocker, right? I mean, that wedding alone should have been enough of a red flag for Josh to see what was coming. But I think he was just too deep in it to recognize the signs. Looking back, I feel bad for the guy, but at least he got out before things got any worse. Weddings are supposed to be the happiest day of your life, but for him it was the beginning of the end. Now, if you think that story's wild, let me tell you about the second wedding. This one's about a friend of my wife's. Her name was Sarah, and she was the sweetest, most conservative, religious girl you'd ever meet. She was raised in a very traditional household, went to church every Sunday, the whole 9 yards. Sweet as pie, but she had a strict worldview. So when she met this guy, Marcus, let's just say her family wasn't exactly jumping for joy. Marcus was great. He was charming, funny, down to earth, and head over heels in love with Sarah. But there was one catch. Marcus was black and Sarah's family, well, they weren't too keen on that. They didn't say it outright, of course, but you could feel it. You know how some people can smile to your face while they're quietly judging you behind your back? Yeah, that was Sarah's family in a nutshell. They didn't have any real beef with Marcus as a person. They just couldn't get past the fact that he didn't fit into their perfect lily-white idea of what a good Christian husband should look like. Now you'd think in this day and age, people would have moved past that kind of small-minded nonsense, but nope. Sarah's parents flat out refused to come to the wedding. Can you imagine that? Your own parents not showing up because they don't approve of who you're marrying. Not because he's a bad guy or anything, just because of his race. It was disgusting, honestly. Sarah was heartbroken. But she loved Marcus. And she wasn't about to let her family's prejudices stop her from marrying the man she wanted to be with. So the wedding went on, but the vibe was strange from the get-go. Half the pews were practically empty because most of Sarah's family didn't show up. On Marcus's side, though, packed. His family came out in full force. Grandparents, cousins, aunts, uncles, you name it. They were loud, proud, and there to celebrate love, which only made the absence of Sarah's family that much more noticeable. And that wasn't even the weirdest part. So, like I said, the vibe at Sarah and Marcus's wedding was already weird from the start. Half the pews were empty because Sarah's family had pretty much boycotted the whole thing, but Marcus's side was packed, full of love and support. You'd think, with the wedding being an emotional day and all, that Sarah would have just focused on the love between her and Marcus, you know? Keep it simple. Make it about their commitment to each other. But that's not what happened. Instead, Sarah seemed determined to make the whole day about race. And when I say she made it about race, I mean she took it to a whole new level of awkwardness. It was like she couldn't stop drawing these cringy, unnecessary comparisons between her and Marcus, and it just felt forced. For starters, let's talk about the cakes. Most weddings have one big cake, right? Maybe some cupcakes on the side, but it's a unified thing. Not this one. Sarah had decided that since they were an interracial couple, they needed 2 cakes. One for her and one for Marcus. A vanilla cake for her and a chocolate cake for him. Now, I'm not talking about something cute and symbolic where it represents their love blending together or anything like that. No! This was straight up dividing the room with dessert. It got worse when she introduced the cakes at the reception. I'm sitting there as a guest, thinking, is this really happening? She made this big deal about how the vanilla cake represented her, and the chocolate cake represented Marcus. I wish I was exaggerating, but she actually said something like, we may be different on the outside, but today we're coming together as one. Everyone kind of chuckled awkwardly, but I could see the tension ripple through the crowd. I mean, come on. It felt like she was trying way too hard to make some grand point about their interracial marriage, and it just came off as weird and unnecessary. But the cake was just the start. The wedding colors followed this theme too. White decorations for her side and dark, earthy tones for Marcus's side. I don't even know why, but they split the reception seating down the middle. It was like they were drawing literal lines between their families. On one side, everything was white. White tablecloths, white flowers, even white meat chicken for Sarah's family. On the other side, they had darker decorations and served dark meat chicken for Marcus's family. I kid you not, it was that on the nose. At first I thought it was a joke, or maybe some quirky inside thing between Sarah and Marcus that I just didn't get. But the more the night went on, the more it became clear that this wasn't some tongue-in-cheek celebration of diversity. It was just awkward. You could feel the discomfort buzzing in the room. People didn't know what to say or how to react. Sarah's few relatives who did show up were glancing around like they wanted to leave, and Marcus's family seemed unsure how to feel about the whole thing. The thing that really got me was that Sarah didn't seem to realize how strange it all was. She carried herself like she thought this whole theme was some brilliant idea, like she was making some bold, progressive statement about love and race. But in reality, it just felt forced and tone-deaf. It's not like people weren't already aware they were an interracial couple. Nobody needed it shoved in their faces with the cake, the decor, and the seating arrangements. And don't get me wrong, I'm all for celebrating diversity. Love is love, and we should absolutely embrace and honor each other's cultures and backgrounds. But this felt like Sarah was trying to prove something, and it didn't sit right with anyone. It was like she was putting Marcus on display, making their racial differences the focus of the day instead of, the fact that they were getting married. The worst part, though? Marcus. He was visibly uncomfortable the entire time. You could see it in the way he kept shifting in his seat, his polite but tight-lipped smile whenever Sarah brought up the theme. It was clear he wasn't on board with how things were being handled, but he didn't say a word. I guess he didn't want to ruin Sarah's vision for the wedding, but man, you could tell he wasn't feeling it. When it came time for the toasts, things got even more uncomfortable. One of Marcus's cousins, a real loud and outgoing guy, got up to say a few words. He started off normal enough, saying how happy he was for the couple, how Marcus was like a brother to him, all that stuff. But then he started making jokes about the white cake versus the chocolate cake, and how he wasn't sure if he was supposed to sit on the dark side of the room or if he could visit the white side. Everyone laughed, but it was that kind of nervous laughter you do when you're not sure if it's okay to be laughing. Marcus looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. And Sarah? She just kept smiling, totally oblivious to how awkward it was. After the cousins sat down, there was this long, uncomfortable pause before the next toast. No one knew how to follow that up. It was like everyone in the room was holding their breath, waiting for the night to just move along already. After the toasts, things kind of devolved from there. Sarah, still on her high horse, went around to each table, talking about how proud she was of her multicultural wedding and how she wanted to inspire other couples to embrace their differences. Meanwhile, Marcus was glued to his seat, barely interacting with anyone. He looked exhausted, emotionally and physically. The whole thing ended with Sarah making this speech about love transcending boundaries, but by that point, most people were just ready to leave. You could tell everyone was tired of the forced narrative she was pushing. The dance floor was pretty empty by the end of the night. No one was in the mood to celebrate anymore. I walked away from that wedding feeling conflicted. On one hand, it's great that Sarah and Marcus loved each other enough to push through the drama with her family. That's not easy, especially when you're dealing with close-minded people. But on the other hand, the way Sarah handled the whole thing just felt wrong. Instead of celebrating their love, she made the day about their differences in a way that was uncomfortable for everyone, including Marcus. I could see how much it weighed on him, and it didn't feel like the right way to start their life together. Sarah and Marcus's marriage lasted about 2 years, but honestly, it felt like everyone was just waiting for the other shoe to drop. You know how you can sense when something isn't quite right with a couple, even when they put on a good face for the public? That was them. After the wedding, things were quiet for a while. They moved into a nice little house outside of town, and for the first few months, it seemed like they were settling into married life just fine. But it wasn't long before we started hearing rumors, little whispers about how things were going downhill behind closed doors. At first, I didn't think much of it. Every couple has their rough patches, right? Marriage is hard work, and adjusting to a new life together can be tough, especially after a wedding as uncomfortable as theirs had been. But then the stories got darker. I heard from my wife, who's still close to Sarah, that Marcus had a temper. It wasn't just small arguments anymore. It was full-blown screaming matches, and things were getting physical. Apparently, it started small. Shouting, breaking things, slamming doors. But you know how that goes. Once the line's crossed, it only gets worse. Sarah didn't tell anyone at first, or if she did, she downplayed it, like a lot of people do when they're in that kind of situation. She was probably in denial, trying to convince herself that it wasn't as bad as it seemed, or that Marcus would change. Maybe she thought they could work through it. But the truth is, once someone's crossed that line, it's usually only a matter of time before things spiral out of control. The breaking point came one night after a particularly nasty argument. I didn't get the full details, but from what my wife told me, it was bad. Really bad. Sarah had said something that set Marcus off. Who knows what it was? Probably something small that got blown way out of proportion. They were screaming at each other, and Marcus just lost it. He ended up hitting her so hard that she almost ended up in the hospital. That was the last straw. Sarah finally saw things for what they were and realized she needed to get out before it was too late. It's scary to think about, but if she hadn't left when she did, who knows how much worse it could have gotten. She packed up her things and left that night, didn't even look back. She moved in with her sister for a while, got a restraining order, and started the divorce process right away. It all happened so fast, like she was trying to erase the past 2 years of her life in one clean break. And honestly, who could blame her? It's one of those situations where, from the outside, you can never really know what's going on inside someone else's marriage. From what I could see at the wedding, and the few times I ran into them after, I knew there was tension, but I never imagined it was that bad. No one did. And the weird thing is, it wasn't the racial tension or the drama with her family that caused their marriage to fall apart. It was something darker, something more personal. The wedding was just a prelude to what was coming, I guess. Sarah got out though, and that's what matters. She's doing better now, got a good job, started going to therapy, and from what my wife says, she's in a much better place emotionally. She's still shaken up by everything that happened, but she's moving forward, one day at a time. I haven't seen her in a while, but I hear she's rebuilding her life, and that's all you can really hope for after something like that. It's funny, in a sad way, how both of these weddings, the one with Josh and Melanie, and the one with Sarah and Marcus, were disasters in their own way. Josh's wedding was this drunk, chaotic train wreck, and Sarah's was this awkward, tone-deaf mess where nobody could relax. And yet both of them ended the same way, with divorce and a whole lot of pain. It's like, no matter how big the red flags were on their wedding days, they still went through with it, thinking they could make it work. But sometimes, no matter how much you want something to be perfect, it just isn't. I guess if there's any lesson to take from these two weddings, it's that not every happily ever after starts with a perfect wedding day. Sometimes the wedding itself is a warning, a glimpse into what's coming down the road, even if you don't see it at the time. I'll never forget either of those weddings, and honestly, I hope I never have to sit through something like that again. It's hard to watch people you care about go through something so difficult, especially when the warning signs are flashing right in front of you. But there's nothing you can do. In the end, though, Josh and Sarah both got out, and they're moving on with their lives. That's what counts. And as much of a disaster as those weddings were, they're just a chapter in a bigger story. Sometimes it takes hitting rock bottom to finally see things clearly. Both of them hit that point in their own way, and now they're picking up the pieces. It's not a fairy tale, but it's real life. And sometimes that's all you can ask for.